Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, August 2025, and our friend Alastair Crooke is back with us. Welcome back, Alastair.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Alastair, I want to start with the situation in Ukraine. We had a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. They talk about the situation in Ukraine, and right after that, Europeans together with Zelensky went to the United States to talk with Trump. What is the common ground that all these parties I'm talking about Europeans, the United States, and Ukraine, together with Russia, can find some sort of common ground to work on? Do you see a common ground?
First of all, just to say that your voice is a little bit broken up as I hear it, but it's enough. Uh, yes, but we have to be clear about what happened in Anchorage and Alaska. And largely that's missing because people have treated this as usual in a sort of secular Western rational approach of what is the strategy, what is agreed, what are the points that have been agreed. And I think really in a sense that they miss the trees for the wood, or rather the wood for the trees, because they just are missing the most important things that happened at Alaska. And so the first, and by the way, the most important things are psychological, not rational, mechanical. They are psychological and they are essentially symbolic. And what I mean by that is that the way that Trump, as he arrived, treated Putin and treated Russia was huge for all of these periods, for long, many years. The Europeans have imposed what they call a cordon sanitaire. In other words, a boycott of Russia. Russia comes in, Russia delegates come into a room to speak, all the Europeans get up and leave. They don't listen, they don't hear. For them, Russia is, if you like, at best a criminal entity, a war criminal perhaps too. And so they've created this sort of fence around Russia of demonization, of not only demonization, but disdain for Russia as a state and for Putin as a person. And then we saw, what did we see? That actually, and who else has had this treatment? That actually the President of the United States, Trump, actually met Putin on the tarmac. Not a foreign minister, not someone else, but Trump himself went to greet Putin as he came down the stairs, and they walked back together. And there was evident for anyone who watched the television shots coming from Alaska, he treated Putin with respect and was friendly and was almost, you could see that there was empathy between the two people. And that is symbolically hugely important. You can't go back from those optics. Those optics are a turning point. Russia has broken, if you like, this cordon sanitaire that the Europeans have imposed. I mean, there are still sanctions and tariffs, of course, but the actual isolation, the boycott of Russia makes no sense after you've seen, the US president inviting him to the US and putting out the red carpet for him, shaking hands, greeting him in a very friendly and open way. And more than that, I probably, to the horror of his security detail, said, come on, share my car. We'll both go together. I think it's called the Beast, but we'll go together in it. And, you know, there's lots of screaming and saying this was in security breach. I mean, who cares? It changed the pattern enormously. So that was, if you like, the first thing about it. Now, what I would say, and here is what I'm going into, if you like, the more psychological aspects of it. Trump, in a way, has become a myth, a mythical figure. He is someone, and his great friend Steve Witkoff once said, you know, that Trump believes that his presence, his commanding presence, can actually compel people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, simply because of the presence of Trump and because he seems to have a commanding presence and he has a myth about him. What do I mean by a myth? I mean really a myth in the sense that a myth in the old world was always supposed to give an inner meaning, if you like. It was to represent a quality, something that was more than just normal. And we can all see, I mean, it's obvious to even the most rational of Westerners that Trump, his career is not that of a normal politician. He has, you know, had assassination attempts. He's had attempts to derail him. He has come back always, almost, you know, at the most unexpected. How many legal cases were against him? Beyond counting. And still he came back. So he is, in a sense, a sort of mythical figure who has really managed to sort of overcome this. And, you know, myths are not necessarily factual. They're not necessarily correct. They contain in them something about a truth. And maybe the truth is something about all the parts of him that the other parts of the West detest, because somehow you create, Carl Jung used to say this, you create your own shadows, your own demons, that you go down to Hades and try and fight. But actually, they come from you. They come from your own mind. So Trump has a sort of special quality of sort of commanding presence. And if you want to see what I mean expressed in existing terms, have a look at the videos from the following meeting at the White House with the Europeans, where they're all sitting in a line on little straight chairs in the corridor, awaiting to go into the headmaster's study. I mean, you know, that also is an optic which is going to change reality. It is an optic. They were all behaving. Go back to 2019 when you had the image of Trump seated there with his arms folded and the German chancellor and all the Europeans towering and leaning over him, wagging their fingers at him. And what was the picture we saw today? Sort of schoolboys sitting in seats in front of the Resolute desk after being allowed in from the corridor. Reminds me of my prep school days going to the headmaster's study. So, I mean, these are optics which change reality. And these were symbolically hugely important. But there is another thing, and I think that explains a lot. If you can understand what I'm talking about by talking about, you know, that some people become myths in the sense that they have a sort of inherent power beyond the normal over other people, that they have either charisma. I mean, clearly, I mean, and I want to make that very clear. I mean, you know, that Trump is not a god, a mythical god. He is a real estate oligarch with not a very cultivated sense of what is beautiful and what is not. And he has an outsized ego. But nonetheless, historically, people who have become subsequently praised to the skies and seen as great figures have actually in practice been quite ordinary men and have been quite often disliked during their lives. I mean, American history has several of those too. So he's not, he's just an ordinary human being. But he does have, and Witkoff perhaps is right. I mean, as I say, you've only looked at what occurred in the White House over this recent days to see, all of the Europeans sort of bending down, yes, sir, in front of him. And that's what I mean by mythical. However, and this is the second point that I want to really make, is who is commanding? Who strikes you as a figure that was actually, clearly a commanding figure at Anchorage? It was Putin. Putin actually also has some of that mythical qualities to him. I mean, he was a completely different person, completely different figure to that of Trump. Characters are different. But they did have, and I think in a sense, this is the bond, if you like, that exists between Trump and Putin, that Trump recognizes Putin as a fellow, as a peer, person of mythic qualities as well. It's not about pressures or compromat, as the West keeps saying. It's he recognized him and he treated him. And there it was. I mean, look at the contrast between the Euros sort of sitting in line at the White House, and when it came to the press conference, who led? Wasn't Trump. It was Putin who spoke first and spoke very confidently and in complete control of the situation. He was at ease. He had a presence. Shall we just leave it at that? And I think this is something that exists between them. And this is why I say something that, we have to sort of try and take into account in understanding this, not just in a rational way. Oh, yes, Putin and Trump met and blah, 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 blah. This is what came out of it. No, something more than that came out of it, something actually that has changed the whole fabric. And what came out of it was also very important and very symbolic, because what came out of this was not a plan, not a sort of detailed deal that, you have a paper and there's sort of 20 points on it, that at all. But what came of it was, I think you might call it an understanding or a framework of understanding and common interests that came out of this. And so what was the sort of basic deal? And this is why it didn't need elaboration at that point, it was a very simple understanding that the Kellogg frozen conflict that has been hanging around the neck of this, if you like, stopping all progress on finding any sort of movement on the Ukraine issue. The Kellogg frozen conflict on the existing lines of the contact lines. And then after that, sometime later, there'll be some politics, is out. It's out, gone, finish. And Trump made that quite clear, that he is shifting to Putin's idea of a political peace solution, political peace negotiated solution that will address the fundamental causes of the conflict, and not just be a sort of, divide it and, here's half, here's the other half, not merely a sort of a land swap, but which will be larger. And I think Putin has made that very clear. Not only, I mean, I don't know what he said exactly, of course, to Trump, but I mean, later when he briefed the Russian sort of notables about it, he was quite clear that there were other aspects. There was Alaska, the Arctic, and it was quite clear that from the type, the people that were taking part in it, the Minister of Finance, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of their sovereign wealth fund, who is effectively, speaks American. I mean, he was at Goldman's or one of those banks, I think it's Goldman Sachs. And so he knows how to speak to Trump and Witkoff in the language they understand and they like. And there were others. And what came out of it is, but just before the meeting, by the way, there was an executive order signed by Trump, which went back and sort of dealt with the Exxon half share in an Arctic field as a sort of preparatory way. But here is what Putin is saying to Trump. Look, the Arctic, rare earths, oil, gas. I mean, all of this, we can jointly explore together, and it'll give you. I mean, you can have Greenland too if you will take it, but I mean, this is, there's a real billions and billions for America potentially in that, but also we need to look at the wider, the security architecture of Europe, because this was original. Deep down, this is the cause of the conflict and the tensions for Russia and in Central Asia. The fact that the agreement at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not move an inch beyond the frontiers of Germany was abandoned, and instead of which they invaded Ukraine. I know it's always put the other way around, but effectively they staged a coup, put in their proxy forces into Ukraine and Kiev, and then started invading essentially Russian-peopled parts of Ukraine in the Donbass. So it was, if you like, the invasion of NATO that really was at the root cause of this, the movement and the continuing. Finland just joined, expanding the border enormously between Russia and NATO. So this has to be on the table, and also nuclear weapons, intermediate missiles. Putin takes this very, very seriously. I know because I've listened to him on one occasion speaking about it personally. I mean, I was in a room and when he was speaking it, and he takes this very seriously, and understandably so, because it is really a very serious issue, particularly the short and intermediate range, but also the START treaty, which is due to expire fairly shortly. So what is the deal? The deal is that it is actually to Trump's advantage, because the thing was so intractable that he was hesitant about getting involved again in Ukraine. In the week before Witkoff went and set up this meeting, he was really hesitant about doing it because it's so intractable. But then, partly because of Epstein and partly because of the Senate, partly because of the deep state, all these pressures on him, he resolved, I've just got to do it. It's got to be done. We've got to get out of that. And we have to, I have to make a give, as he called it to one of his interlocutors, to the MAGA. because, it's not just Epstein, it's also what's happening in Gaza. It is also, what's the threat of more war. This is what's roiling his base. I mean, and it's not just MAGA, it's young Americans. I mean, the crucial demographic of, the young Americans up to 35. I mean, their position is changing towards Israel, and it's changing towards the idea of wars. And, this is really an existential issue for Trump with the midterms coming up, because he only has, I think, a margin of 3 in both houses, in Congress, in the Senate, and in the House. I mean, that can change. 300 million spent here, 300 million spent there by the opposition. Who knows what will be the result? So I think finally he felt he has to do it. And there is advantage to Trump in doing it in this way, in which Trump allows Russia to force the issue, to militarily force a solution onto Zelensky, Ukraine, and onto the Europeans, to force it by military means onto the people to produce this outcome. It's not clear how long or whether this will really happen, but that is clearly in Trump's interest, to stand back and let Putin force an outcome. And it's happened before. If you go back to 44, long time ago, but this is what happened with the war with Finland. Eventually, the Soviet army forced an outcome, and there was an agreement, and a certain amount of territory was given up, etc., etc. So I think Trump sees this as an advantage. And so the deal, if you call it that, but really it's just an intellectual framework, it's not worked out, there aren't details of it, is simply, I think Trump said, listen, you push this, you bring about an outcome in Ukraine, because it won't happen any other way. I mean, by a frozen conflict. Where's the solution in that? It's not going to happen. So Trump effectively is saying, I'm out. I'm leaving. I'm getting out of this. Over to you. You can do this. And I, in my own way, will manage the Europeans and try and manage the Senate and all of that. And how does he do that, managing it? Well, in Trump's own way. This is all I can say. He floods the information sphere with so much noise that no one really knows whether he's coming or going or leaving Ukraine or coming back to Ukraine, and the Europeans go away sort of feeling sort of quite confident until they find out that actually there are no security guarantees that are meaningful coming out of America that they had counted on getting at this meeting. So, I mean, he's I think, trying to manage these pressures on him. And this is important to Putin too, because, Putin is not without pressures, and he has pressures from those, and there are many who are Russians loyal to Putin, but fear that he will be pushed or compelled into a Minsk III. That is a further sort of compromise of the sort that led ultimately to a renewed bout of war, and that all the deaths that Russia had suffered to get to this point would be not sufficient, and they would have to spend more young men's lives again in a few years' time after the West rearmed the Ukrainians and so on and took them forward. So I think it's important to say, first of all, that the fact that the outline provides for a solution for the first time, at least has a framework that it hasn't been filled out. It's just a sort of encapsulate, and it hasn't got the details in it. And it probably can't have the details because there are so many pressures, so many forces acting on both of these two principles at the moment, that, it's going to have to go along. So it's not inevitable that there will be a success at all. I mean, we may end up going back to escalation because of because the people who are opposed to it may try and blow it up by doing some provocative action against Russia or something else, or trying to, if you like, ruin the agreement by putting sanctions and further pressures on Russia. I mean, there are plenty of ways to stick an oar into the works, but this is at least the sort of framework that could lead the way ahead. And it's come about, as I say, because first of all, the psychological impact that Trump created of greeting Russia as a fellow great power and acknowledging it is enormous. And it's also by, I think, his acceptance that Putin also was of the same stature as him and treated him with deference and with respect. And that has laid the groundwork for a certain degree of trust between the two of them. Whether it's enough, one of the great difficulties with Trump is because he's so whimsical, this is part of his character. I mean, he says one thing and nearly blows it up when he goes to the White House and starts saying, well, I wouldn't rule out boots on the ground in Ukraine, and, yes, there'll be some sort of American security, forcing Rubio to go around in his wake saying, listen, calm down, everyone calm down, there are going to be no boots on the ground. In fact, as he said very clearly, America's not going to give any more weapons, any more money. If there are weapons going to Ukraine, it's for the Europeans. If there's to be security guarantees, the Europeans are going to give those security guarantees on their own account without going back. Oh, America can coordinate a bit, but it is not going to backstop it, which is the key word, because all of the Europeans know they cannot do this. They cannot actually go into Ukraine as peacekeepers or whatever if they don't feel they have a backstop, that America will come and back them up. And that was said very clearly. No way are we going to backstop you on this. You want to do it? Go ahead. Put your money in, put your weapons in, take it over. Of course, Europe can't do that. In fact, I mean, this is a ridiculous situation Europe is getting itself into, is that, as America moves away from its full hegemony, and it's leaving it to the sort of peripheral provinces of Europe to take over the burden of empire in that part of the world. They don't have the money. They don't have their inventories for weapons are pretty well empty. So it's not going to. I don't think it's realistic or even serious. Will they come around to accepting this position, that what's happened at Anchorage? I'm not sure that they're capable. The narrative, the American, European narrative, we are strong, they are weak, is so embedded in so much of the Western narratives and thinking that it means that most people don't even have, the facts that they keep stating have to be fitted around the narrative of we're winning, they're losing. And so it's going to be very, very hard for the Europeans to accept this, particularly the Europeans to accept that, no, we are losing. That's going to be profoundly difficult and have great political consequences, which is why they're in such a state of desperation and heading off like kids to Washington to try and see if they can pull back Trump from his position. So, there may be retribution coming that will upend this whole process. But nonetheless, if there's no Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donbass, the war goes on. If there is no change, no political acceptance from Zelensky and from Kiev, then the war goes on. And that's really the prospect that we have, and perhaps the most likely outcome, that the war will just go on. I mean, it's obviously reached a critical moment in what we see happening at Pokrovsk and that sort of fortress line of cities in Donbass, which is clearly crumbling and breaking up. And that will have a profound impact on Ukraine, I suspect. So, but that seems to be quite likely to be the most probable, I would say, outcome. But don't rule out the fact that, they eventually, sometimes people begin to sort of to come to terms and look truth in the eye and say, and whether they're Ukrainian or whether they're European, and say, well, we lost the war. We've lost it. And it's time really to accept that and to start thinking about what that means and how we need to reorientate ourselves, how we need to see ourselves for the future. We can't just go on doing the same thing, which fails. We have to start rethinking a great deal about our strategy and not just about Ukrainian strategy. So that's where I think we are.
Yeah. Alastair, when it comes to the security guarantees to Ukraine, we know that there is some sort of differences between the European party and the American party. They don't feel the same. How do you see the security, the most important elements for the security guarantees for Ukraine, and that would be acceptable somehow? Russia can get along with those terms. Do you feel that would happen with the current situation and with considering Zelensky as the president of Ukraine? Is that possible with Zelensky, or there has to be some sort of drastic changes in the government in Ukraine to achieve that?
Well, first of all, Russia has, which has really a veto over what it will accept or not accept. I mean, it's fine for Europeans to say, well, we're going to put in European troops as peacekeepers. But Russia's made it quite clear that if they are done without Russian agreement, they will be treated as enemy fighters and killed. So that's why the Europeans are so desperate to have if you like, backing from the United States. Why then are they putting in ineffectual numbers of troops? I mean, because Europe can probably bring together perhaps at most 25, 30,000 troops. But the contact line is nearly 2,000 kilometers long. And, that requires vastly more troops than that to sort of try and monitor it at the best time. What they're doing is they're trying to put in tripwires that, if even either that Russia will cause it to trip or they will fake a trip of the tripwires. And then they will say in America, no, Article 5, you've got to come in, NATO Article 5, we're under, you've got to come in and you've got to deal with that. And, Trump and his team sees the ambush and says, no, thank you, no American boots on the ground. I'm president and I'm saying it. No American boots will go in, which means that they're not getting backed up. So, where has all this come from? I mean, first of all, I think you have to look back, you have to go back to the agreement, the Istanbul in April 22 agreement. And that had security guarantees in it. It provided for security guarantees for Ukraine. No one mentions that in Europe. of course, because the security guarantees were not coming from NATO states, it was coming from non-NATO states. China was going to be a guarantor. Russia itself was going to be a guarantor. Probably India would have been a guarantor. Who else? I don't know. But there would have been other guarantors of, if you like, that. And that the guarantors would also oversee the level of troops numbers that Ukraine had, the type of weapons they had, and would have a veto power over any treaties that they engage in with other states, foreign states. So that's the type of security guarantees that the Russians are thinking of. And I think Trump has been told that, what they think, by Putin probably. And, he sees this as not unreasonable. He knows that if NATO goes in, then, his MAGA team will go nuts. They'll say we're on the road to World War III. So he doesn't want a NATO war against Russia. And if China's willing to do this and other states are willing to do this, to provide some sort of security guarantees, what's wrong with that? So I think that what we hear, all that we've been hearing about security guarantees, and Witkoff comes back and says the Russians are open to these things. I think the Americans are spinning it. I mean, I don't think that we know that the Russians haven't suggested that. Land swaps. How could there be land swaps of the four within those four oblasts? Because it's in the treaty, it's in the constitution. They're constitutionally now part of Russia. And the wording of that actually says the residents of those four oblasts are forever Russian. That's what it says in the actual act that brought them into the constitution. So, I mean, even if Putin wanted to, he can't change that. It would have to go through a whole process in the constitutional court, etc. So this is really, I think, something that the Europeans are heaving at as hard as they can to get some sort of the Trump to agree to having French or British troops on the ground. But first of all, it doesn't make much sense because they say, oh, well, our troops will be far back. But, Russia has said very clearly, we don't care where you are in Ukraine. If you're in Ukraine, we will kill you. So, I mean, it's not going to, I don't think it's going to work. I've seen no sign during this period of any walking back by Russia, of any of the commitments they made on 14th of June when Putin spoke at the foreign ministry in Russia, and he laid out the conditions for ceasefires, and he laid out the aims of Russia, and he laid out the conditions for also for, if you like, denuclearization and also demilitarization of the armed forces. And then we hear also other stories. All of these, this is what I mean by noise. The whole thing is being filled. And all of the noise is coming from American sources who may be well inclined or not well inclined towards an agreement coming out of this. So we hear that, they should have had guarantees. They had guarantees because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for guarantees from the West. Nonsense. They didn't give up any nuclear weapons, Ukraine. Those were Soviet weapons, and the Soviets withdrew them. That's all. There was no Ukrainian nuclear weapons given up to anyone. They were just withdrawn. So, of course, there weren't any security guarantees in respect to its giving up of nuclear weapons. Nonsense. So, I mean, there's a lot of this noise and trying to sort of shape American policy and American public perceptions of what is possible. And Trump has to deal with that. And one of the ways he does it is very frustrating, I think, is, as I say, to fill the information space with, sort of things that sound one way and then sound differently the next day, and everyone is a little bit uncertain. But you notice, and I think this is what confirms me in my sense of what I've been relating to you, is the Russians are very careful. They don't go out and contradict Trump every time he makes a statement here or a silly statement. They don't. They do lay very occasionally a very clear statement. There will be no NATO forces in Ukraine, such as that. But they don't, try and sort of score points or say anything. In fact, the reverse. They stay quiet. This is the other part of the deal. Putin takes responsibility for forcing an outcome, and Trump tries to sort of manage the Western sphere, if he can. I mean, it's by no means certain. There are so many things against him. And these things like Epstein don't go away. They keep coming back. And we're told they're going to come back after Labor Day in America with, other activities trying to bring Epstein back to the forefront. And he's very frustrated. Trump is very clearly very frustrated. And I think we hear from someone who was talking to those in the West Wing. They said, he just feels, he didn't want to get back into the Ukraine thing because it's intractable. But he said, I've got to do this. I'm going to do this. I have to give something to the MAGA people. I mean, he's got to square his political circles as well. And the MAGA are getting increasingly in turmoil. I mean, not just from Epstein. Epstein touches on something, that MAGA, as opposed to just generally American young people, but MAGA people come from a community that generally goes to church and is conservative in their thinking. And child abuse is just abhorrent. It's another order of horror, so vile that people, cannot just, yes, these people have been told, oh, well, your leaders, congressional leaders and so on, they lie to you, and they have to sort of live with that. They know that politicians lie. They know that they steal. They know that they accumulate lots of money. And they live it, but abusing little children, this is not in that category at all. So that is sort of still there. And just one of the things that happened just before this came up was in Britain, a book came out about Prince Andrew, and it's caused a storm in Britain. It's focused mostly on Prince Andrew's sort of sexual appetites and his financial shenanigans in the book, but it also refers to Trump and Epstein and the connection between the two of them and their maneuvering together mainly about women and about the Princess Diana in particular, who could get there first. So that is, and again, so this comes in now. Trump says, I didn't know Andrew, but there are hundreds of photographs to show that he did know Prince Andrew. And Andrew was a fixture in the New York scene. I mean, for people who wanted to sort of rise up in the social hierarchy, a British royal is a sort of, ace card to be able to play. And so, lots of people, including Trump, probably knew him and saw him as a magnet that could draw in other people of interest to them. And then you have Melania launching a lawsuit against the Biden son for suggesting that it was Epstein that introduced Melania to Trump. So again, it's back in the public sphere. And I think, he was going around saying, how do I get rid of this? How do I get from under? How do I get from under Epstein? How do I get from under these people in the Senate who are trying to take control of the Republican Party back? How do I get out from under all of these people? How do I get out from under the deep state, who are going to do their best to destroy me? Well, he sends off Witkoff to Moscow to ask for an urgent meeting with Putin. I think, there have been talks through Belarus for some time before. But as I say, it's not, it's not a blueprint for the political solution. It doesn't say what land will belong to whom or how it's to be achieved. But it is a basic, if you like, intellectual understanding, which is, I'll do the heavy lifting with the Europeans and with as much as I can with these American forces. Putin, just do it. Get on, do it, finish it, and then we can tie up all the details later.
Alastair, when you look at Europe and European leaders, do you think that their priority is the security architecture of the region? Do you see any sort of sign that they're concerned about it?
Yes, I mean, but they see it as simply in a sort of one, optic, Russia. But, do they really see Russia as a threat? Yes, but not in the way in which we think of it. Everyone can work out, Russia has no ability and no interest in invading Europe. And indeed, one of the things that was mooted, I'm not sure that it's in the public domain much, but one of the things that has been said, I don't know that this is from Putin per se, but in those sort of circles saying, yes, we can give security guarantees too. We could change the Russian constitution to prohibit any invasion of Europe. And so we can give security guarantees to Europe. But apart from that, it's pretty obvious. The last thing they want, they've got enough land, they've got enough resources. The last thing they want is to be responsible. They've tried that once before, being responsible for a lot of quarrelsome Europeans. And it's not a good place to be. That was what, led to the end of the Cold War. So, they remember Czechoslovakia, Prague, all of these things. No, they certainly don't. Do Europeans, and one part of their consciousness, they understand that quite clearly. They also understand that Europe is nowhere and will not be for years in a position to do anything about Russia if it wanted to. So what is it all about? Well, it's all about the fact that the Europeans have really built the whole political project, their whole European, their whole globalist project around the idea of Ukraine, and that Ukraine is a European state, which it isn't, it's a Slavic state, that it is a European state, and that any changes to that threaten the European Union, threaten the European political project. The European political project is fragmenting anyway, but they are now desperate to try and keep it intact. It's like in America, it's a huge slush fund, European Union, of money that circulates, money laundering, money goes back to politicians, back to legislative projects and so on. There's a huge circulation of money that takes place in Europe, in Brussels, just as in Washington. It's a boondoggle, really. And so they're desperate to keep it going because they know that they are getting further and further severed from their constituents. Their constituency really dislike, I would say, use the word despise the elites, the technocratic elites in Europe. They think they regard the ordinary Europeans with contempt, which they do, and they show contempt back to the elites. Now it's getting to a very serious point where the economy is contracting so severely, and it was very much on the brink, that many Europeans, even middle-class Europeans, are struggling to make ends meet, really struggling. Prices go up. The cost of living in places like the UK and London is just unbearable. And so there's huge tensions. And then there's immigration. And that is the sort of crux of the political crisis that is coming. So Ukraine, where does Ukraine fit into immigration? It doesn't at all. It's immigration that is threatening to blow up the UK. There may well be violence over the summer. Maybe they will get through it. But most of Europe, this has become not just a hot issue, but this has become an existential issue as people lose their jobs. And one of the things that is evident and should be evident everywhere, there aren't good jobs. You can talk to people in their 30s, 35-year-olds. I mean, and let alone for the sort of 22-year-old coming out of university with a blank CV. I mean, and they're saying, and young people are saying, look, we can't even get an internship now because, people say, you got a degree from where? Oh, forget it. I mean, do you think that's going to make me employ you? Have you experience? Let's have a look at your CV. No experience. Okay. You've done no internship? No. And so there really is a problem of getting of jobs. So this is the desperation. Forget about Russia. Forget about Ukraine ultimately. Of course, it's all dressed up, shout war with Russia. We need conscription. We need a big, big army to fight Russia. It's nonsense. The real desperation is because the only thing holding together this European project has been waving the Ukrainian flag and saying Ukraine is part of Europe. And it's artificial because, as DNA shows and as linguistics show, I mean, Ukraine is as much Slavic as Russia is Slavic. It's not a European country, if that make in an obvious way. I mean, there may be different ethnicities in Europe, but it's not, evidently a part of European mainland. So factions are breaking out. The key thing is energy is so costly in Europe. And then von der Leyen, made this abject concession to America that Europe is going to buy liquefied natural gas at about 5 or 6 times the cost of pipeline gas, made the promise to send billions. And at the same time, Europe accepted to impose a 5% tax on all of Europeans to buy American weapons through the industrial complex. So-called, NATO has to make its commitment to the defense of Europe, which comes down to buying 5% of all of our incomes will have to be sent off to the military-industrial complex in the United States as America. Of course, they're going to try and build us build it out in Europe, but I mean, that'll take 20 years to do that sort of change. And Europe is no longer really an industrial center. It is to a certain extent, yes, but to shift that, what you're going to do is Mercedes-Benz going to just produce tanks in the future? I mean, it's not quite so easy. And they're going to do that with debt. And the problem is debt is becoming toxic, becoming a real problem. The fiscal position of Britain, of France, is drastic, really severe. So this is the problem. It's not Russia, it's not Ukraine. It is the fact that Europe is heading into a major recession. Its economies, German economy particularly, is shrinking, but all of Europe is shrinking, and and yes, you know, there's the class of the elites, and they're pretty well untouched by this. You know, if you look at hotels, you look at this holiday season, the really top end, you know, hotels, €1,000 a night or €6,000 a night, they're full. You go after that, most of those are half empty. You look at France, half of the restaurants are half empty. There's certainly something going on. It's the same in all over Europe. Look at the restaurants, half empty. No, I mean, if you go to the Michelin, you know, the fashionable top end where they're all oligarchs sitting there at the table, they're doing well. But it's a tiny little sector, and the rest of it is foundering at the moment. So that's what it's about. It's not about really about Russia, except that this is their sort of flag under which they try and, you know, keep their position, to keep a sort of the ability, because, you know, insisting on support for Ukraine is the way of closing down opposition. That and Gaza are the ways they close down opposition. As you will know, Gaza is used absolutely in Britain and in France and in Germany to close down any statements or any criticisms of government action.
Alastair, do you feel that Europe can manage itself without the United States? Because it seems to me the way that they desperately want the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine, because they can keep the United States in Europe. They can keep the links between the United States and Europe, and somehow Ukraine is a motive for them to keep it on and to go on with the plan in Ukraine in order to have the connection between Europe and the United States. They did a lot. You look at the bonds, the treasury bonds of the of the United States, you see the United Kingdom is buying them and just going up. The curve is going up while the Chinese bond is coming down. And what is Europe today? Do they really want to be a powerhouse? Do they really want to be some sort of vassal for the United States? Because it's so much important for the future of Europe. Think of it.
I think the optics from the White House in these last days, the line of European, A-team sort of sitting on little chairs in the corridor waiting for their turn to speak to the president. I mean, Europe, it's the end. The optic spells the end of the idea that Europe is anything other than sort of a regulatory system of control of a market system, that it doesn't have political power. It's at odds with China. It's at odds with Trump, effectively. They're trying to undo Trump. They're trying to, to pull him back and to impose their will on Trump. And they have no real political weight. They're regarded with contempt by Russia. Russians won't talk to the Europeans at all. And now they've had the example, while they've been spending all this time of not talking to Russia, not dealing with China, look what happens. President of the United States invites Russia to the United States and meets him with full honors there. I mean, makes them look very, very stupid. So no, I don't think it's going to be a political area. But what is worse is that the Europeans are beginning to understand, I think, what the Treasury Secretary, Besant said the other day. He said, we are going to look at Europe as if it was a sort of American sovereign wealth fund. So the Europeans are going to provide the finance for our reindustrialization of America, either by sending the companies there, either the European companies will come, or we are going to use tariffs and other means to make the Europeans reindustrialize America. In other words, it's going to be another form of appropriations, which is not coming through Congress. And they're financing this in very strange ways through these special, either bitcoins and special digital currencies that are not regulated and are going to be quite separate. But this is going to be, a new money supply coming into the United States. So, and many people are buying the stable coins at $1 each, thinking that this is going to, sort of be a good buy. But of course, it's backed up by nothing. The prospectus says, well, yes, we hold some US treasuries as reserves. And that's how these people who sell these stable coins make money, because they take all the interest on the US treasury bills and they give none. The things are just denominated at $1 exactly. And so, it is in effect a Ponzi scheme, because, as soon as people stop buying it or start asking for their money back in dollars and not just in tokens, then these schemes will have to start selling US treasuries, and that's how typically these schemes crash. So America's financial system is not a great deal stronger than the Europeans' financial system, but they, like Rome in the times of the empire, are drawing back into the capital, the Roman capital, and taking the provinces are going to have to finance Imperial Rome or Imperial Washington, and I doubt, and from all I've just said to you before, you asked me, the Europeans don't have these resources, really, I think, to do this. As it is, it's creaking under the weight. Put bluntly, the Europeans can't finance themselves at this stage. Literally, they cannot finance themselves. The costs of maintaining the system to which Europeans have become accustomed, the welfare, if you like, safety net, the health services, all of these things have become so costly. And then they have to pay for all these immigrants. And you've seen there's been, riots outside hotels in the UK, finally settled in court the day before, where, there were protests every day against this series of hotels that has been taken over by immigrants, particularly after a small girl was assaulted by one of its inhabitants. And now the courts have said, no, they've all got to go, and the government doesn't know what to do at this stage. So, these are the tensions building and building. But this is the financial reality underlying it. Just as America has found, it can't finance itself as it was. It can't afford, however many military bases around the world and all of these exercises. And they're having to deal with a debt that is a fiscal situation that is out of control, and debt that is growing at the rate of something like 1 trillion every 3 weeks. The interest payments on the debt, not the debt itself, growing much faster. How do they actually manage this? How do they deal with this? They can't. They can't, and nor can Europe. It cannot afford itself any longer. So can it afford America too? Is he going to pay for Americans' welfare and America's military adventures? That's what they're being asked to do. That's what the message that has come from Bassent and from others, saying, we'll put tariffs on you if you don't comply, or sanction you. And so the tariffs will go to pay off some of our debt. In fact, much of the tariffs will be paid for by Americans. It won't be Europeans necessarily that will be paying those tariffs. There will be a trade-off to a certain extent.
Alastair, before wrapping up the session, I'm really interested asking a question about the South Caucasus. We've learned that Iran and Armenia are talking about the new corridor connecting Iran to the Black Sea, going against those sort of idea on the part of the United States, Zangezur corridor between Armenia and Azerbaijan. How, and on the other hand, it seems that Israelis and Netanyahu is in a situation that he may attack Iran as well. That comes to the question of the importance of the region, Armenia and Azerbaijan. They can be used to attack Iran again. How do you see the things? And we've learned just before coming up, we've learned that there is a new agreement between Iran and Belarus. They're talking about improving the relationship in all fields, security, defense, all of these conditions that are happening. How do you see the region, the South Caucasus, and what's going on there?
Well, as, if you like, Americans, or at least, the deep state is slightly divided in America on what to do next. In that there is a deep, deep Russophobia in parts of the United States whose roots go back, long, long time. I won't go into that. And there is the other part of the deep state that looks at China and it sees its extraordinary growth since it sort of joined the World Trade Organization, and have come to the conclusion that China, if it continues, this curve, which has been going steeply up, is about to become exponential. And that then it's impossible to stop. There's nothing America can do to stop China outpacing America as at least the dominant economic power in the globe. And that frightens the Americans enormously. So there is a sort of struggle that goes on in the deep state between those two views. One saying, we don't have long. This is going to turn exponential soon in tech and in manufacturing capacity in China. So we don't have lots of time. And the more you go on wanting to escalate in Ukraine, talking to their colleagues on the other side of the desk who are in the same deep state and saying, well, but we've got to inflict a defeat on Russia. Russia has got to understand that NATO has defeated it, that we are strong and they are weak. And they say, yeah, but, we can't do all these things together. I mean, it's not me saying that. That's RAND organization has said, America hasn't the wherewithal, financial and military, to do more than one conflict now. And which one is it going to be? So there's this debate going on. But meanwhile, that deep state is increasing. If it can't win, if it can't change Trump on his present course on Ukraine, is going to escalate the pressures everywhere on Russia, including through Iran. Iran primarily is the key one. So what's happening in Azerbaijan is precisely a plan to put a corridor promoted by Turkey, because much of the Azerbaijan elite is of Turkic origin, leading through to parts of Central Asia, which are also Turkic. There's this sort of whole Erdogan idea that there is a whole Turkic sphere that leads up to the Urals and beyond. that is essentially, and their languages maybe sound very different, but they're essentially one language, and it's Turkic. So he's been used by NATO to promote this idea with Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan has been acting very dangerously. First of all, by providing support, not necessarily direct, but allowing Israel to, and facilitating Israel's attack on Iran on the 13th of June, by providing airspace and allowing standoff attacks to take place against Tehran by going through Azerbaijani airspace down to the Caspian and firing from there into Tehran. But it's also Azerbaijan, again, inspired, I suspect, by, there's now one of the biggest American embassies in the world in Azerbaijan. And Britain is there too. That you remember the spider's web attack on the strategic nuclear aircraft of Russia a couple of months ago, I think it was, where pre-positioned, if you like, containers and trucks were put there with sliding roofs that they could fire drones at Russia's strategic aircraft, strategic nuclear capable aircraft. What has been, I'm told, I cannot confirm it, but what I understand, because there's been a huge roundup of Azeris inside Russia at this time, and that the Russians believe, rightly or wrongly, that the Azeri criminal organizations, which are well known in Russia, they've existed there for some time, were behind the pre-positioning of some of these drones that were pre-positioned, ready to fire at the strategic fleet. And Russia is pretty unhappy about that, very unhappy about it. So on the one hand, Azerbaijan and a rather sort of now NATO-orientated Armenia have come to terms of trying to open the Zanzibar corridor, and have indeed, the proposal is a 99-year lease on it. And they say that will be secured. I don't know if that's still the case at the moment, but originally it was said there would be 1,000 US troops that would secure the corridor, which runs right along Iranian border. And then will go on, and it will go up into more of the Turkic areas, Kazakhstan and so on, beyond, creating a corridor all the way from the Mediterranean through Turkey, up there through Baku, and then on. For Iran, this is a casus belli. This is a cause for war. They are not going to have American troops, NATO, sitting on their northern border. And it seems that Russia is playing its part, because as you saw quite recently, actually a few days ago, the destruction of the refineries in Odessa and of the fuel tanks, big fuel tanks, huge explosions that took place. Well, those were owned by Sokal, which is the Azeri energy company, major energy company. And earlier, 2 refineries in Ukraine were also destroyed by Russia, which, as I understand it, were personally owned by the president of Azerbaijan, Aliyev. So there's pressure being put on Azerbaijan by Russia now, because that's a big loss, because this was the transit point for Azeri light crude to go through to Europe, but also to Israel. And so that's been destroyed in these last few days completely. And of course, now Ukraine is retaliating, if you like. It's destroying the oil pipeline to Hungary. It's destroyed the oil pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia. So we're in, this is real war. It's not in the headlines. It's not much noticed by the world, but there's that. And Israel is, of course, trying to create another corridor that would go straight close to Iran, called the David Corridor, which effectively goes from the sort of Golan area through Sweden and then up towards Iran from Sweden through the Kurdish area of Syria, and then goes up through Al Tanaf and then up to this area. So they're opening another sort of corridor for Israel to get closer to Iran and to put it on the position. And the Americans talk about, perhaps an Azeri invasion or a Baluchi invasion or something like that of Iran. Iran, Israeli understands that, all this is leading up to something big. And you said, is a war coming? It looks like it. It doesn't make much sense because Iranian missile capabilities demonstrably they attacked Israel as it's never been attacked before, and caused real damage. And the game changer is the accuracy that they can land a missile on one building without doing damaging to the collateral damage to the other buildings. So it doesn't make much sense, but it looks like the Israelis are taking fright that the Chinese are supplying Iran with the air defense systems, the ones that were so effective, if you like, taking out the Indian Rafale planes, several of them. And so they're taking fright. In fact, the whole talk about having destroyed all of Iran's air defense is not true. They say, oh, well, Iran only had 2 S-300s. That was it. I don't think this is true. And if they get these Chinese, and there's certainly been, we've seen videos of these cargo planes coming in from China. So it may be true. I can't confirm it, but that's what Israel says and what's worrying it. And so they are looking, while, the world is preoccupied with Ukraine and all these things, they're creating mayhem. Lebanon is on the verge of civil war. Syria is already in civil war, is balkanized and is fragmented. People are being killed there all the time. Thousands are being executed. Christians, Alawites, Shia, all of them are being brutally killed and executed by HTS. To the point where people are beginning, I saw an Israeli headline saying, was it really such a good idea to get rid of al-Assad? Is this what we wanted? It's absolute mayhem in Syria. It's terrible. It's just really sad. It was a great country, and now it is just struggling to feed itself, struggling for everything. And at the same time, the former ISIS elites are talking about building an underground in Damascus with the money, rather than to give food to the people. We can imagine that there will be a large contract, and much of that contract will maybe disappear. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Alastair, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on your program. And thank you, the listeners, for your patience.
Yeah, it was amazing, by the way.